Welcome to the Why on Earth Community's Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series. Today, I have the opportunity to visit with Kevin Townley. Hi, Kevin.
Hello there. Aaron, how are you today?
Doing great.
All right.
Thank you. We're going to have a really interesting conversation on the alchemy of fermentation and the microbiome. And we're going to get into some fun philosophy, theology, mystical, esoteric topics as well. This is going to be a really fun episode. And before we dive in, I want to tell you a little about Kevin's background. He is a student and a scholar in theology and philosophy. And during his formative years, spent 10 years in a monastic setting with the Carmelite Order. More recently, he is very involved with the Freemason institution, specifically as the Grand Lecturer here in Colorado, where he is in charge of the esoteric work of the fraternity, working with his committee, the custodians of the work. Kevin has also worked as a professional alchemist and did that for many years and ran an alchemy lab for a couple of years. And Kevin was telling me that back in 2008 in Aspen, at the Aspen Institute, he encountered Father Thomas Keating, some of you may know the name, talking about alchemy and the microbiome and so forth. And Father Keating from that Cistercian monastery in Snowmass indicated that that was one of the best talks he had ever heard on the topic. Is that right?
On the topic of the Eucharist and why it is what it is, yeah.
On the topic of the Eucharist, and one of the things we're going to get to in this discussion on fermentation and the microbiome is how that plays into the tradition, the sacrament of the Eucharist, and some of the other traditions from around the world. So, Kevin, thanks for being with us today. It's so great to have this opportunity to talk with you.
My pleasure, Aaron, yeah.
So we're talking about the alchemy of fermentation in the microbiome. What is that? What are we talking about there?
Well, fundamentally, and it's no mystery to a lot of biologists and nutritionists, at least more current ones, that we have within our own makeup. We have 50 trillion cells that make up our human body, but even more than that, there's all these microbes that live within our body, particularly in the gut, intestines, stomach, and so on. And they present a culture, just like we have cultures of the Hebrews or the Celts or the Chinese. There's a culture, and the culture tends to multiply itself when it's left to do whatever that culture does. And the same is true with the cultures that live within our body. And if there are certain environments created, then we have healthy cultures in our body, and health and well-being is the consequence. And if we create an environment for unhealthy cultures, then usually disease and a variety of unwholesome things happen within our body. And so whether or not, we can know about what to do and then not do it, but the problem is, or the situation is, that if we create the proper environment for our internal ecology, we can have control that and create a whole new system for ourselves and that culture that lives within us.
Yeah, so interesting. So sometimes we talk about it's as if we're each running a farm in our own bodies with these different microorganisms that live inside of us.
Sure.
And more of us are becoming aware that eating certain probiotic foods that have these living cultures in them, is one of the ways we can maintain very healthy internal microorganism cultures.
Not just the probiotics, but there's also prebiotics.
Mm-hmm.
And the prebiotics usually feed healthy organisms that are living sort of in a ghetto within our gut, that are healthy, but they've been so overwhelmed by other cultures that they're sort of off to the side. And if you get the proper nutrients, the prebiotics for those organisms, then they start to thrive and the unhealthy ones start to starve. And then there's a whole transformation in the culture within the body. So probiotics are great to get things started, but the prebiotics seem to be, according to the literature anyway, a more sustainable way, because the probiotics tend to die off in short order, but the prebiotics help create a healthy condition for the existing culture and make it more healthy so that it becomes dominant.
So that's, it's sort of the foundation, if you will.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is super interesting. So, what does that have to do with the Eucharist? And before getting into the topic of the Eucharist, with our stewardship and sustainability series, one of the things we do from time to time is speak with different religious and spiritual leaders, elders, etc. We had Safi Koskas on the show several months ago. He's from Saudi Arabia doing great interfaith work throughout the world. And, not all of us are practicing Christians, obviously, but worldwide, I think it's safe to say that the influence, the impact of the Abrahamic tradition, the Jewish, the Christian, the Islamic traditions is substantial. It's significant. My research for Why on Earth showed me that some 5 out of 8 people on the planet identify as being affiliated with one of the Abrahamic traditions. So I'm curious to talk about this sacrament of the Eucharist with the microbiome in mind, Kevin, knowing that not all of our audience is necessarily Christian.
Sure. And one of the important things to understand about that is that, a lot of people they have no religious background whatsoever, make bread.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And what do you do when you make bread? Well, you add a leaven to it. That is a yeast. And what happens is that the yeast begin to eat the sugars that are within the flour, and we put it in a warm spot, and the dough rises, and there creates gases and things. But what really happens is that there's a transformation from the flour into a living food, and then it has the different types of cultures that are put into the flour, and it eventually becomes a living bread. Same is true for the wine. And that the wine is grape juice, generally speaking, and there are all varieties of wine, but let's just take the grapes, and they have their own natural sugars, and when you add a different strain of yeast to the grape juice, it creates a product that doesn't exist in that form in the natural world, and that is alcohol. But there is a living culture within that grape juice, and it becomes a living drink, if you will. And if it goes too far, that culture dies and another culture is generated, which produces vinegar. And so the main idea behind all that is that there's a living culture that's transforming something into something else. And so the concept of a living bread and a living wine is something that really gives us an interesting understanding that we're drinking something and eating something that actually changes the internal culture of our bodies.
Yeah.
Or kombucha.
Right.
It's all the same thing, or sauerkraut or whatever.
Yeah.
We're ingesting these foods that change or support cultures.
It's interesting to me that we see living cultured foods in traditions all around the world, all around the planet. You mentioned kombucha. There's living sauerkrauts. There's kimchi. All kinds of different things. A lot of our modern industrial foods have eliminated that living component. So you today can go and buy a shelf-stable version of sauerkraut on some aisle that does not have that living culture in it.
Right.
And I'm wondering if there may be a connection there. Certainly the literature is bearing this out, between many of the health issues that we're seeing, not only physical, but even potentially mental and emotional health issues that are related to not having as much living cultured food in our diets as we once did.
I sure would agree with that, yeah. And I think that the modern nutritionists and biologists would agree with that as well. It's a whole new way of looking at things. I say new, it's not brand new, but it's becoming more scientifically verified than, say, some of the theories that were presented maybe 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
It has now become scientific fact.
Now there's this interesting connection. Some of us who are doing work in the realm of soil stewardship and carbon sequestration through soil building, soil regeneration, are working in the biodynamic tradition. And of course, Rudolf Steiner, a great esotericist of about 100 years ago, spoke about the connection between our guts as being analogous to the soil in the landscape on the farm. And we're seeing similar research emerging now and really validating how important that living microbiome is in the soil. just as it is in our own bodies. And Steiner was sort of all over this, way ahead of his time, we might say. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, as somebody who has studied different esoteric traditions from all around the world, are you seeing any insights or wisdom emerging in that connection that we might apply in our world today?
Well, I think that those who went into those types of studies sort of had the advantage of not having to demonstrate everything scientifically. Mm-hmm. But a lot of those ideas have been around for, I would say, thousands of years. I met this one, where was he from? Peru. He was a Peruvian farmer. And I actually met him at the same conference that I met Father Thomas Keating in. Mm. And he got his PhD in agriculture from Greeley at the University in northern Colorado there. Mm-hmm. And after all the things he learned about soil and fertilizers and all the modern agricultural practices, he said, he still goes up and opens up a guinea pig and does the augury observation and interpretation. He says he finds that much more fulfilling and the information is more valuable than a lot of the newer types of agricultural practices that have been going on for the last 75 years. So the indigenous people tend to have that deep connection. And in the alchemical world, it's called the signatures of nature, that there are things that are connected to the earth, and those who are, by virtue of their background and attention, are also connected to the earth and to the signatures of nature. And so we find that these ideas are not new, but because of the path we've taken scientifically, probably right around the close of the 18th century, we went from an alchemical worldview to a chemical worldview. Mm-hmm. And there's a great book that was written called The Dwellings of the Philosophers by a very curious individual by the name of Falconelli. There's even a question whether it was one person, perhaps a group. But in that book it says that chemistry is the science of effects and alchemy is the science of causes. And so, attendant to your comment that these things go back, and our connection to the earth go back millennia, but we have sort of severed that connection, and perhaps it's part of our process to be able to look at the minutest details and to separate things, and then eventually recombine them. So now, after the close of the 18th century, science went into that separation mode, but now it's coming up against itself, and it is recombining its ideas with the living aspect, because it's kind of divorced itself from the life aspect, but more about the form aspect, or the breaking things down and look at everything in separate parts and not wholes. Yeah. And so now we're looking at things more from a holistic point of view. Even scientifically, the more advanced sciences are now seeing that interdependent nature of reality. But you alluded to about the earth and our guts. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's such an exciting time in that regard, to be alive and to have these advancing tools that we have that allow us to see the very minute, for example, with these microorganisms. It's absolutely remarkable.
Yeah. And I think, too, that the soil in our internal biosphere is one example of that interconnectedness, but there are many other examples of that interconnectedness, whether when it deals with our consciousnesses or our spiritual connection, telepathy, and so on. Those are two very important pieces, and they allude to many other interconnected parts within our life and world, and in even our solar system and galaxy. I mean, that's getting out there, but there is that interconnectedness, and that first part just alludes to these other areas.
Yeah. Well, I'm very curious, Kevin, with your background, your knowledge, and you've studied many of these interconnected esoteric traditions in a depth and to a degree that not too many people accomplish in a lifetime. And I'm just curious, with that background, is there a specific insight or a specific piece of wisdom or recommendation you would share with our audience in general about these times that we're living in?
Well, I've always kept pretty quiet about all these things. I mean, those who are interested, I'll have the conversation. But It's really difficult because it's certainly been mostly an individual journey.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've come to understand is that we're in a process, and humanity as a whole is moving in a particular trajectory, and there are resistances to moving in that direction. So our whole species, if you will, and we won't even include all the other kingdoms that are involved in that same journey, is moving towards a place of unity, of familyhood, and so on and so forth. And there are resistances to us taking care of each other. And we can see that in our political climates today. And you have these different camps that are interested in really making sure that we are proclaiming each other's needs and caring for each other as a family, as opposed to thinking that everybody's on an individual path, and if you don't earn it and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you're out of luck.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that movement. And the point that we eventually have to arrive is that full awareness of the familyhood of humanity. And that is one of the key factors that drew me into the Masonic institution, because one of its primary principal focuses is that very thing, the familyhood of humanity, the cultivation of truth, and the relief of suffering in the world. And those are the three pieces. If I could give any thoughts or wisdom or advice to anyone in the world, is that if you can gauge yourself by those three principles and have those being the motivating factors in your life, and ask yourself the question, is it truthful? Mm-hmm. Is it relieving suffering? And is it establishing the familyhood of humanity? And if it doesn't pass muster with those 3 points, then something's wrong. Mm-hmm. Because the direction we're going on is to synthesize all 3 of those principles. And that's how I choose my political candidates. Are they truthful? Mm-hmm. Are they relieving suffering or causing suffering? Or are they establishing their familyhood of humanity or creating division? Mm-hmm. I don't have to talk about Democrats or Republicans, just are they following those 3 principles? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I think that the study, you can go into all these great subjects of numerology, astrology, Kabbalah, gematria, and so on and so forth, and they'll tickle the brain cells, and they're very transforming in certain ways. But when the rubber hits the road, that's where it counts, right there, those 3 principles.
Mm. Well, my understanding, which is limited, is that the founding of this country, the United States, was caused in great part by some Masonic leaders, George Washington, Ben Franklin, and others, and that there were fundamental ethical foundations laid that certainly over time take effort to realize to a greater and greater degree. But I'm curious what your read is in terms of how the founding of this nation occurred in the context of that evolution of humanity and where we might be going in that sense.
Well, I went to Philadelphia, to the Independence Hall, and there was a great, what do they call him, park ranger there, and he was a black man. And one of the more interesting things that he said was that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is a promise. Mm. Now, sometimes it takes a while to fulfill the promise. And so while we have had tremendous scars on our history relative to slavery and genocide and the treatment of the indigenous peoples and the repression of women, all those things, if you look at what occurred at that time and the culture in which they unfolded, we have made tremendous progress, but we haven't fully completed and fulfilled the promise. Mm-hmm. And so in order to do that, we have to be able to elect our leaders who will adhere to the fundamental principles of which this country were founded on, and that is a government by, of, and for the people. Mm-hmm. Not by, of, and for institutions that basically rape and pillage the resources of the citizenry, moving from a democracy to a kleptocracy. I mean, we can see that even happening, in our own country right now.
Kleptocracy meaning leadership by the thieves.
Right,
basically.
leadership by people
Yeah.
taking the money and leaving others to suffer as a consequence of that greed and selfishness. So the Masonic principles that some of the founding fathers had still survive today and are really the most excellent tenets by which we can operate by. The there has been a deviation. You know, it's like if you're on a hike and you're heading towards a particular goal in the mountains, you might get into the thick timber and you don't see the goal anymore, and you might wander a little bit, but eventually you'll gain sight of the goal again, and then you have to reorient yourself. And I think that our nation is in the process of reorientation toward those principles, and hopefully with some of the newer leaders that are coming up, particularly many of the women that have just come into the Congress, I have great hope, particularly with some of the younger individuals who seem to be more occupied with caring for others than seeing how they can take advantage of them.
It's beautiful. Well, connecting a thread back to an earlier part of our conversation where we're talking about microbiome, we're talking about some very complex living systems and aspects of this reality that our science has been really sort of catching up to being able to observe and understand in a more nuanced manner. And it makes me think, my gosh, in some respects, the microbiome, the neurobiochemistry going on in each of our bodies, the complex wood wide web, I've heard it called, the network of living organisms across kingdoms of living species throughout the soil, throughout the forests, are so complex, so far beyond any of the technologies that we've developed. And we're just, as a society, really kind of catching on to how amazingly complex these systems truly are. And there's a whole other realm of complexity in the esoteric and mystical studies. And I know you've written a couple of books. I brought copies with me, one being The Cube of Space. We'll show this to the audience. The other being a follow-on, Meditations on the Cube of Space. And by the way, where can people get these if they're looking to get these?
Well, right now I think that you can get them on Amazon, or you can email me and I'll send you copies. But they're for sale on Amazon.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or contact you. Okay, great. You're dealing with some pretty complex information in these books as well, that tie to the Hebrew tradition, the Hebraic tradition, the Kabbalistic tradition. So for our general audience, the Cube of Space, what is it? And how is that something that relates to our lives?
Well, there are several things. One is that it deals with an investigation into the process of creation. And, you know, there's the Big Bang Theory. I believe the Big Bang happens every day all over the place. And when someone generates a creative thought and follows through with some very positive actions and so on, it really does foster and generates a whole creative process. So in these two books is really a way of understanding to some degree how it is that we can actually bring about changes in our lives and in the world according to how it is that we hold our creative thoughts. Now, there are a lot of books that are written on the subject of, you know, of creativity, but there's a lot of information that's left out. And so we think about limitation as being a negative thing. But in these books, it really looks at limitation as being a tool. That so when you're going to create something, you impose the limits on what it is you want to accomplish, so that you're not a mile wide and a half inch deep. So you get to have something very specific, and you create the boundaries by which that thing will come forward. And so it investigates that. It gets into some very intellectual aspects, particularly technicalities of the Kabbalah. But if I was to give you the nuts and bolts, the ultimate cliff version of that would be, it really has to do with the creative process and the power of limitation. And so the first book is really about the information, and the second one is about practices and how one can go about generating certain, not just creative threads of bringing something in a manifestation, but also when we get back to the concept of fermentation. What is also employed in both of these books are symbol systems. So there's the symbol system of alchemy, of the Kabbalistic system, of masonry, of geometry, and number. And all of those things together, when approached as a practice, will transform the way you think, how you perceive the nature of reality. And we too often will observe things and take them at face value.
Yeah.
When there's, just as if you're looking at soil, it's, look at all that dirt, okay, but it's not, I actually had a horticulturist study, it's not dirt, it's soil. And I thought, okay, but there's all this life that's in there, or sometimes lack thereof. And to be able to look at the livingness of something. For example, when I was working in a laboratory, I used to do a lot of plant work. It's called spagyrics, plant alchemy. And I would dig up a plant and I would clean off all the roots, and I would notice that there's a place on the root that is not plant and it is no longer soil, but it's the place in between the transformation or even transmutation of the organic and inorganic compounds that are absorbed by the plant that transform it into living vegetable matter. That's an amazing thing. And when you can see that slight transition, it's not unlike dawn and dusk. It's not daytime, it's not nighttime. Sun hasn't come up or the sun's gone down and it's still light. There's those in-between states. And it's those in-between states where we can begin to perceive the transformations that take place, not just in the world around us, but also in ourselves. And so in the symbol systems, for example, I use the Tarot and I use number and Hebrew letters and a variety of other symbols. When you work with them consistently and understand the application, that's like having a tool and knowing how to use it, you will change and you will transform, and for the better. But you have to be able to be willing to discipline yourself to go through that process. And so that's the main thrust too, is not just learning how to create something intentionally, but also how to transform your own nature, to become more aware of and identify with that inner presence that in Christianity it's called the soul, or in the Hindu tradition it's called Krishna consciousness, or in Buddhism it's the Buddha consciousness. So those are all available to us, but it's not available easily if all we do is just kind of summarily just sort of scan over it. It's like making chicken soup. You want to make chicken soup, you got to boil the chicken. You can't just pass it over the boiling pot and call it good, right? So there's a certain intensity that has to be experienced and undergone. But you'll be a happy camper if you do. You'll understand the consequences of that type of meditation and study.
I'm so excited to hear about this and to share this with our audience. I know in May 17 to 19, the Y on Earth community is hosting a 3-day summit called Massively Mobilizing Sustainability, and Deep Leadership for the 21st Century is the subtitle. And we're bringing together executives, educators, entrepreneurs to explore aspects of leadership in these times when we are faced with the incredibly urgent task of healing and regenerating ecosystems, of healing and restoring social relationships and communities, etc. And it requires an even deeper type of leadership for us to get through these challenging times, I think, Kevin. And it's amazing to me to hear you describing something that seems to actually relate in a very important way to leadership. And in our culture today, we are fed so much through the media images of what success looks like, the next shiny car, whatever it might be, the certain neighborhood, the certain zip code, and it's such a superficial story. And beneath that, there's this opportunity for depth and for authentic experience of growth, of development, of leadership. And I'm so excited you're going to be at the summit with us in May, because I think part of what your sharing can do in our culture is deepen and activate and accelerate the type of leadership that's really needed in these kinds of times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, leadership doesn't have to be out there running for Senate or Congress. Sometimes just community leadership or grassroots leadership that gets felt in the larger context, because people gather together with massed intent and behind someone who has an idea that helps transform the local and eventually the larger context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. And of course, we're living in a time now where we can communicate all around the planet.
That's right.
And we have these tools at our fingertips that are extraordinarily powerful. And the hope is that we increasingly wield these powerful tools in a manner that is devoted to the cultivation of the familyhood of humanity and relief of suffering and cultivation of truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I used to have to travel to libraries to get information. Now you get a USB stick.
Yeah.
And it's got the Library of Alexandria on it, right? It's like, well, not exactly that, but huge numbers of volumes about information. And some child in Nigeria can have all the information that man has right here in the palm of his hand. That's so exciting.
Yeah, absolutely exciting.
Yeah.
I want to remind our audience that this is the Why on Earth Community's Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series. And today we are speaking with Kevin Townley. And we're discussing a variety of topics related to alchemy of fermentation and the microbiome. We might even say the esoteric mysticism of leadership. And I want to make sure to mention our sponsors making this podcast possible. A big thank you to the International Society of Sustainability Professionals. A thank you to Purium, to Waylay Waters, to Earth Coast Productions, and to the Association of Waldorf Schools of North America. Thank you for your support for making all of this possible. Also want to mention, for any of you who would like to check out any of Kevin's books, again, you can get those at Amazon. Kevin Townley, Cube of Space, and Meditations on the Cube of Space. We can also provide you a way to connect with Kevin if you're interested. And then for any of you who might want to check out any of the Why on Earth publications, be sure to use the code Why on Earth to get a discount at whyonearth.org. And also, if any of you would leave a review and a like on the podcast channels, that is much appreciated. So we have covered a lot of information here, Kevin, and one of the things that strikes me in all of this is when we're talking about the microbiome and soil in our bodies, we're talking about the creative force, we're talking in a sense about life force, about a certain type of energy that we probably understand all that well. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you could shed a little light on what's fundamentally at play there.
Well, I can only give you my understanding of it, and I certainly have been in a quest of that myself, and with the limits of my own awareness. But we're really dealing with the life principle. So, for example, there are three basic principles in existence in the forms, and that's the form aspect, the consciousness aspect, and the life aspect. And so we're getting the form aspect down pretty good in terms of the separation that took place, as I mentioned, in the latter part of the 18th century. We've analyzed stuff, talked about its chemical components, and so on. We can take a butterfly and tear it apart and talk about all its constituent parts, but we'd be hard-pressed to make a butterfly. I'm sure there are those now that could clone one, and we don't know so much about that, but there's that's the life principle. We also have the consciousness aspect. In each particular kingdom, in the mineral kingdom, the consciousness aspect is crystallization. Minerals crystallize. And that's their one-trick pony. They can do that really well. In the vegetable kingdom, we have a perfumed radiance, or the flowering of a plant. It demonstrates its type of consciousness. And the reproduction of its own kind through multiplication, many, many seeds. In the animal kingdom, we have instinct. In the human kingdom, we have self-conscious awareness. Those are modes of awareness and consciousness. we're psychology and various types of studies have entered into that. We don't fully understand the whole thing, but now we have artificial intelligence. So we're beginning to create types of intelligences. But the life principle is the one that is really the big piece we're trying to identify. And so in alchemy, what it has tried to do over the millennia is isolate that life principle and purify it and create an elixir out of it so that one can regenerate the body, raise their consciousness, and perhaps even eventually transform the physical sphere into a higher level of being. So that's the mystery, the life part, and so we feel the life, we know and we feel great, and we know and we don't, and we see life come busting forth in who knows how many hundreds of billions or trillions of metric tons of vegetable life that pounds out through the earth every spring, and then it goes back into the earth again when it breaks down, unless we harvest it for food. So the life of the vegetable kingdom and of the human kingdom and the animal kingdom and so on, they demonstrate themselves, but we still haven't got, okay, how do we do that? And we don't know. But there may be certain pockets of science and or other groups that have been at it for some maybe 1,000 or plus years, and maybe science for 40 or 50 years. But there is that effort to understand that life mechanism and the switches that get turned on and off in the human being. You know, when we start growing up, or certain switches get turned on, and men have testosterone and women estrogen, and they start operating accordingly. But then when you get a little older, those switches get turned off, and you start growing hair where you don't want it, and losing it where you do. So, but it's those life mechanisms that get turned on and get turned off, and that's what some of the more advanced health companies are engaged in understanding those mechanisms. And so we feel it, we want it, and it's still a mystery to most.
So I am so struck that one of the big tasks in front of us right now is collaborating with natural forces to sequester carbon through soil building, to healing and regenerating ecosystems, collaborating with this life force as it is working in all of these different contexts and with all these countless numbers of species. And I'm also struck that in our spiritual traditions, the greatest teachers are teaching a message of love.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if there isn't perhaps a nexus where it's love and intention we humans can bring into the ecosystems and into our communities that will help collaborate with that life force in a mysterious way to help us get through these times where, as you said earlier, we've lost our way in the woods a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you hit it right on the head, the love aspect, because we're too focused on the form aspect, and which translates into acquisition of wealth, of property, of things that by many standards determine one's success. But when you fill out an application for a job, you get the questions about your resume. Where'd you go to school? What'd you study? What is your experience? I've never seen an application that said, what is your spiritual experience? How well can you express love in the world? We don't have that. In Bhutan, they have, you probably know this, a department of gross national happiness. You've heard that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We don't have one of those in our cabinet here in the United States. Gross national happiness. So that's a measuring stick, and we don't use that measuring stick, but there are other cultures that do. And so we're not asked about our capacity in those particular areas. One day perhaps there will be. Just because one can love doesn't mean they're qualified for a job, but at the same time, that level of compassion and concern for others is really what's going to take us in the right direction. And there are many that are doing that now, or trying, but they're meeting their resistance of self-centered, selfish individuals and corporations and so on that are not concerned about that. Matter of fact, they don't care at all.
It's amazing to me to see more and more this sense of service awakening and enlivening in our culture. And thinking about the different ways you've referred to transformation, transmutation, even transubstantiation. And I wonder if, as individuals, as leaders in our communities, corporations, organizations, we each might be able to activate a bit more of this wherever we're situated.
Well, that's how it works. That's the whole idea behind a leaven or putting yeast into something. That when you put a person or a group of people within a context, and they're loving, compassionate beings, it becomes contagious. We all want that, really. Even if the outward expression of an individual is doesn't demonstrate that. When they go home, they like to cuddle with their kids and love their husband or wife and express that. So we all need that. We all want that. But a lot of times we only want it for our little family or our small community or a religious group or a national group, and we don't think about
Expand
it
that.
in terms of a worldwide familyhood. We'll get there, hopefully, but as long as we don't do some terminal damage to each other, like destroy the planet.
Right.
If we have a place to live, humanity is on that trajectory, but it has to overcome some of the difficulties that we are now facing in the world.
Yes. Well, Kevin, I am so grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you today, and I'm really excited and grateful that you're going to be with us in May at the Stewardship Summit, massively mobilizing sustainability. And on behalf of the Y on Earth community audience, thank you for visiting with us today. And before we sign off, is there anything else you'd like to leave us with?
I don't think so. I mean, I think I said what, unless you have another question, but I think I probably said what needs to be said.
I have one more question. You reminded me, and because you have such a depth of knowledge around the Hebrew, this word Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, can you riff on that for a minute or two for us?
Well, I could, and it's interesting, that Tetragrammaton doesn't come into the creation story until we hear that Yahweh was walking in the cool of the day and noticed Adam and Eve, they were wearing fig leaves, right? That's where we get introduced to that being. But in the earlier section, and interestingly enough, that in the book of Genesis, any talking of deity is always called God. Doesn't matter what the word is. So we have Elohim, which is the deity that is involved in the creation of night and day and the fishes of the sea and their soul and the birds of the air, etc. That's the being that creates the whole first few chapters of Genesis, and they even create Adam and Eve. So when we get to Yahweh, it's a different aspect of deity. Very interesting. And I know this isn't very popular in more traditional rabbinical circles, but if you go into the Hindu tradition, we have Brahma, which is sort of analogous to Yahweh if we were to compare pantheons. But there's also a para-Brahma, the Brahma before creation. And so in the book on the cube of space, there's a para-Yahweh. And that being creates a container that the universe can enter into. And so once that container is created, the para-Yahweh, which is Yod-He Vav, becomes Yod-He Vav-He. And so there's the material aspect of deity. And I know this may run afoul with some of the more traditional rabbinical scholars, but the Sefer Yetzirah kind of lays it out there, and I just speak to the truth of that.
Well, I probably imagine many of our audience don't really know that this word Yahweh that we'll use, and that might be familiar, is coming from these Hebrew characters Yod, He, Vav, and He.
Yeah.
So that's the truth. That's the story there.
That's the story, and they're more familiar with Jehovah, which is the Latin word for that name. So, and I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a great Hebrew scholar by any means. I'm certainly not a Hebraist in terms of language. I probably know enough to make myself dangerous. However, when one begins to examine the intricacies of the name and the earlier part of that name prior to the second hey coming into the spelling of the name, it raises a lot of questions about the whole creative process. And that's why the Sefer Yetzirah, one of the great Kabbalistic texts, really speaks to that whole pre-creation story. That because that story took place, Genesis can take place, which is pretty amazing.
Truly,
Yeah.
truly. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for being with us
You're welcome,
today.
Aaron. Thanks for
Sounds
inviting
wonderful.
me. Alrighty.
The Why on Earth Community Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series is hosted by Aaron William Perry, author, thought leader, and executive consultant. The podcast and video recordings are made possible by the generous support of people like you. To sign up as a daily, weekly, or monthly supporter, please visit whyonearth.org/support. Support packages start at just $1 per month. The podcast series is also sponsored by several corporate and organization sponsors. You can get discounts on their products and services using the code WHYONEARTH, all one word with a Y. These sponsors are listed on the whyonearth.org/support page. If you found this particular podcast episode especially insightful, informative, or inspiring, please pass it on and share it with a friend whom you think will also enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your support. And thank you for being a part of the Why on Earth community.